Well, I think we're about ready to go. We certainly appreciate everyone joining us this afternoon. We have Ms. Kari White. She works with Neogen Genomics and is part of the group that runs our genetic evaluations. And Kari's going to discuss on data collection, specifically on birth weights, weaning weights, yearling weights, how that data factors into our genetic evaluations, as well as how to collect that data and then maybe how to select off of that data within herd and whatnot. So we would ask, just like in the other sessions that we've done, use the question and answer box down there. That way we know where to find your questions. And without further ado, we'll turn it over to Kari and let her give you a little more details and start her presentation.
Thanks, Collin, for that introduction. So as Collin said, my name is Kari White. I work with the genetic evaluation group at Neogen GeneSeek. So that's the place where you send your samples for genomic testing and also where your genetic evaluation is done. Neogen, previously Livestock Genetic Services, has actually been running the BBU genetic evaluation since 2015. And so we've been working with your data for quite some time. I came into Neogen's genetic evaluation group in, last year, or actually maybe a year and a half ago. Time flies when you're having fun. And so I've been working with the BBU data for quite a while now and have gotten to do some novel traits for you guys and things like that. And so I'm happy to be here today. See if I can get my screen to, okay, here we go. So I work with genetic evaluations, and really, we can get very technical when we talk about genetic evaluation, but the real goal is to be able to accurately and fairly compare animals in different groups, different birth years, and different herds, so that we select the animals that are going to be the best parents for the next generation. So it's all about selection, and it's all about making sure that you're making progress in each generation you have in your herd. And so, as I said, if we want to accurately and fairly compare animals, we have to account for a couple of different things before we even start the genetic evaluation. And so if we want it to be accurate, we need the most possible information included in the analysis. And so as a geneticist, sometimes I get the question, do I still have to take weights if I am doing genomics? Do I still have to do scanning on my animals? And usually I answer that question, yes, to all of the above. So as a geneticist, I want it all. I want weights, I want dates, I want scan information, I want pregnancy information. I want to know when those animals leave the herd. And I also want genotypes, because it can make the evaluation a lot more accurate if I have all of those things. And so if I want to fairly compare animals that have all of that data, I want to drill all the way down, taking things like environmental differences, differences in gender, differences in birth year, differences in herds. I want to take all of those things out and drill all the way down to the genetic component of why that animal performs the way it does for birth weight, say. And so that's where the fairness comes in a genetic evaluation. And as geneticists, this is something that we spend a lot of time on, because even if we spend a ton of time making the most advanced genetic evaluation in the world, if you're not comparing animals fairly, you're not going to be selecting the best animals for the next generation in your herd. And so we do this by data adjustments and contemporary grouping in the evaluations. And so this is what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about data adjustments, and you'll hear me talk a little bit about contemporary grouping as well. And so did you know that when you take a raw weight, say a raw weaning weight, you cannot compare raw weaning weights, So unadjusted, not ratios, not in the genetic evaluation, just a raw weaning weight like published in a sale catalog. You can't compare raw weights between animals with dams of different ages. So in your herd, you can't compare a weaning weight from a calf in the same calf crop, but a calf that has a 3-year-old dam to a calf with a 5-year-old dam. You can't fairly compare those two calves. You can't compare bulls and heifers. I know you guys probably already know that. You can't compare animals from different environments in the same herd. So our cows, my cows at home, some of them run the summer closer to town, which is down by the river, and some of our animals run way out in the canyons, which is near almost no water anywhere. And so when I'm doing genetic evaluation on those animals, it wouldn't be fair to compare them, even though the calves were born in the same year, because they're run in such different environments. You can't compare animals with different birth years, even in your same herd. So if you are trying to compare an animal that you're keeping back for a bull this year to an animal that was born the previous year from him, that's not a fair comparison. And you can't compare raw weights on animals from different herds. So hopefully the take home here is comparing raw information on animals is super risky because you have a lot of things going into the performance for an animal that you're not taking account for, like environmental differences, pen differences, herd differences. You don't take account for those things in raw weights. And so I always say it's like comparing apples to elephants. You really can't compare animals fairly using just raw, unadjusted data. And so when we start a genetic evaluation, if I was to start from scratch with the BBU evaluation, it all starts with adjustment. So I would look at your data, and this has been done for you guys, and we also do look at these things as your data changes over time to make sure that we're accounting for the correct population. We look for animals outside of the, just really common sense limits for weights. Do you have a 2,000-pound weaning weight? That's probably not correct. And so those animals don't get included in the evaluation. There's also limits for days of age. So if you have a weaning weight, but you say that the animal was 0 days old, that doesn't make sense. And so we would exclude that animal for the evaluation. So we take the age of animal into account, and we also take the age of the dam into account. I was just looking at some data yesterday, and you could see a very different trend in weaning weights and birth weights for animals depending on the age of their dam. And so, dams that are young, probably all the way up to 5 years, it was like a nice growth curve like this, but it really showed that the age of dam affected the birth weight of the calf. For 5 to 10 years, it's almost linear, but then after that, you start to get this drop off again, where the older a female is, the less her animal weighs at weaning. And so we want to be able to fairly compare those animals, so we adjust in the evaluation for the age of dam. And so these are the data and age limits that BBU currently puts on any of your data to be going into the evaluation. And Collin, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that you also do this for any data that you display on your website. And I also think that these data and age limits are sort of public knowledge. And so you can always look and be told from people in the office what these limits are. And I think the important thing to note here is especially the age and days. Because I think sometimes people take good weaning weights and they just might be like 1 day outside of the window. So you might weigh an animal at 301 days of age, or 119 days of age if for some reason you're really early weaning, and then those weights would not get used in the genetic evaluation. So when in doubt, contact the office or look on the website and make sure that your animals are within those limits there. And I know just from talking to Lance that sometimes it can be confusing because people will put in, you know, their animals' weights in sort of a standard 205-day formula for weaning weight. But BBU actually uses a nonlinear adjustment for weights. And so it's up here, and I know that anytime I put up an equation, everybody gets kind of nervous about it. But the take home here is that we're accounting for the animal's weight, we're accounting for the age of the dam, and we're accounting for how old that animal is when we adjust the data. That's the real take home from this page. And so this is just a table that has the adjustment factors by trait that BBU is currently using. And like I said, don't get too hung up on the individual numbers. They really don't matter as much as you knowing what goes into those adjustment factors, which are age of dam, age of calf, and then as you can see, there's also, for some traits, different equations for both bulls and females, because we're trying to remove that gender effect. And I just wanted to note, and I'm sure no one has this problem in this registry, but it's very important to submit data on all animals. I know that some people think that if they submit data on their poor performing calves, it'll make everyone in their herd look bad. That's just not true, and I'll talk about why in a minute. But I think it's important to understand the concept that EPDs are all about comparison. They compare the performance of animals against each other. And so if you report weights on only your best animals, say your top 50%, like I'm going to talk about in the example to follow, it makes your great animals look only average. And so poor performing animals are really important. They might almost be the most important animals in your herd because they make your great animals look awesome. And so, for example, and I'm sure no one does this, but in example A, you report all of your calves in this group of 10 bull calves with weaning weights. And so the average weaning weight in this group is about 625 pounds. The lightest calf weighs 101 pounds below the group average, so he ratios an 84. So if we remember back, ratios, anything below 100 is below group average, above 100 is above group average. The heaviest calf in this group is 117 pounds above the average, so it has a 119 ratio. And the middle calf is only about 14 pounds above group average. So he's still at about 102 ratio, so a pretty decent animal. And so if you take this same group of bull calves, but you only report the top 50% of the calves, so the medium calf and the heaviest calf, then it moves your group average up to 675 pounds. And that's the real take-home point there, is if you only submit a certain portion of your data, you change the group average, which will change all of your ratios, all of your adjustments, all of your EPDs, because we're comparing against each other. And so if you do that, then your heaviest calf, who used to be 117 pounds above group average, is now only 67 pounds above group average, and he's only 110 ratio, where before he was a rock star at about 119 ratio. And look at what happens to this middle calf here. He was pretty decent before, still above group average, and now that you've only reported certain calves, you make him the lowest performing calf in your group, and you make him 36 pounds below group average, and he only ratios an 84. So you can see how that really hurts these animals by only submitting some of your data. And that's not just on weights, it's on ultrasounds, it's on genotypes. I know sometimes people only genotype keeper animals, animals that they're sure they're keeping as replacements. So an example would be to genotype only the heifers that get pregnant. We need the genotype from that heifer that doesn't get pregnant. So I know it's hard to genotype whole calf crops, but that would really be the goal, because it's helpful to have the genotypes on those cull animals, so we can know what the genetics of the lowest performing animals look like. And so I know that Lance can kind of talk to you about this if you're looking at genotyping or scanning, and you're wondering which animals you should go ahead and do that on, and you don't quite have the ability to do the whole calf crop. I know that Lance can really come up with a plan for you to make sure that you get a fair representation of your data. So the bottom line here is don't be weird when you're submitting data. Just go ahead and submit data, weights from your entire calf crop. That way we have a really good snapshot of how your herd performs. And so the point of all of this, of all of the weights, all the scan data, all the genotypes, all the parentage, is that that information all goes into the BBU genetic evaluation. And actually, we're adding some traits to this list, but you'll see that the weights are all grouped together here, along with scrotal circumference. And that means that we run all of those traits in one model because they all give each other information. And so, as we know, birth weight is related to weaning weight, which is related to yearling weight. And so since those traits give each other information, we run them together in the same model. Same with all of your scan traits and ribeye area. We include weaning weight and yearling weight as reference traits in those analysis, because we know that certain animals won't have the ability to have scan data because they didn't have weaning data, for example. And then we run calving ease direct and maternal in a model with birth weight included as a reference trait. And we're also working on stayability and age at first calf for you all right now, doing some new analysis and research analysis on that. So I'd love to answer any questions if you have any.
So once again, if you don't mind, use that question and answer box at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be glad to get Kari to answer any questions that you might have. Kari, some of the questions that we get so often are, and you'll talk pretty in depth about recording all animals across the board on all traits, but can you go into a little more detail about how important it is if they leave one off or they get something registered and come back and need to record that information? How it can still impact the next genetic evaluation, even if they missed it with a group?
Right. So, Collin, just to repeat your question. So your question is, say they missed recording some data on a group, can they go back and record it later, you know, as long as they have all the information, and will it help that group going forward? Is that right?
Correct.
Yeah, so the big thing on recording weights, especially, you know, weaning weight, yearling weight, is the date. And so say you missed recording or putting in the database weaning weights and yearling weights on a group of animals, but you do have the dates on those animals still, by all means, go back through and record them. It will change how the groups look. It'll change that contemporary group average like I showed, but for the better, especially if it's poor performing animals, because you'll start to get a better look at the spread in that group, and you'll get a better look at who the good animals are in that group. So you can go back and record data in the past. You just need to have the correct birth dates and weaning dates and things like that.
One of the questions that we have is, what happens if some of my calves are set on a feed test before they're a year old? Do I have a reason to assign a different contemporary group to that group?
No, so you don't have to assign a different user contemporary group because, of course, we'll have the days of age of those animals when they're weighed and when they're sent on test. And so they'll get separated out by their age. And so you don't have to put them into any separate groups. And I should say, be careful when you set user-defined contemporary groups. Isn't that something that you have in the database, Collin? An ability to say these animals were treated differently. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. That is correct.
Okay, so I would just caution you, when you would use that user-defined contemporary group is, you know, in the instance that I talked about where we have calves that are weaned in two very different environments. That's a good time to use that. Be careful using that because you break up your contemporary groups into smaller groups. And so you kind of decrease the accuracy in the genetic evaluation if you break up groups too far. So especially on feed tests where you don't send maybe your whole crop of animals, be careful about breaking those up into too small of groups.
Okay. Another question, Kari, was how are some of the ways to go about weighing newborn baby calves?
Sure. So, you know, there's a lot of different ways. There's scales that you can lift on backs of trucks and things like that. Usually, I think the best way is to kind of go to your local sort of tractor supply or animal supply and find the best way that people in your area are actually weighing calves. I would be hesitant about anything like using, you know, measuring the hooves and using that to estimate. I think actual weights are always best. And I think the timing is really important. I know that, you know, a lot of people calve out in larger pastures and things, but as close as you can get to the actual birth date is very important.
Okay, another question is the collection of hot carcass data important on animals that have been through the feeding process?
Right. And Collin, you can probably speak on this in like sort of the list of priorities of traits that BBU is concerned about. But carcass information in general is important because it gives us an idea about how those animals are actually performing in the economically relevant trait, which is meat. You know, that's why we raise beef cattle. And so hot carcass data is a good tool, and we do put that in our selection tools that we create for you all.
Another question that we get quite often, and you talked about not being able to compare, you know, certainly raw weights, but what is the best way if we're not quite through an evaluation and an animal just has interim EPDs, but they want to compare within herd and making some decisions, looking at the weights within their own groups, what would be the best thing for them to look at and to utilize in that scenario?
Sure. So if an animal doesn't have EPDs with accuracies yet, you can either use the pedigree average EPDs, which take into account the sire and dam's EPDs with all the adjustments and things like that. And they kind of look at what the expected genetics of that animal are. That would probably be where I would be most comfortable selecting. But you can also look at ratios. As long as you're looking at animals within the same gender, the same herd, and the same birth year. And so groups that are run together, contemporary groups of animals, you can look at their ratios.
Okay, there's another question. I have a small herd of 10 and all my females are AI'd. Is there a guide on all the information that I need to collect? I haven't done so yet, but would like to learn and start.
Sure. So I'm not sure if BBU has a guide, Collin, but I know that you can go to beefimprovement.org the Beef Improvement Federation website, and they have a lot of really great resources on how to collect any trait that you could be concerned about. And they also give sort of like a calendar of what traits you should collect when in the lifetime of an animal that I think is really helpful. And then if you go to ebeef.org, that is a website that a bunch of the research and extension agents from the universities have come together on, and it has a lot of great information on data like that. And also it's a good way to keep up on sort of the hot topics in the breeding and genetics world as well. So those are two great resources.
We also quite often get requests on where they can go just to get more generalized information on collecting traits, evaluations. Are there some resources out there that you could share with the group that are good quality resources that are backed by, you know, pretty proven information and groups that stand behind them?
Sure. I actually think, you know, any of your county extension or especially state extension, you know, I'm more familiar with Colorado and Kansas, but I know that they have great state research and extension websites that have lots of research on them, lots of sort of informational documentation and things like that. And, you know, that is information that comes out of you know, research done at those institutions. And so I think it's a very credible source.
And then with the onset of all the genomic work that's gone on out there over the last several years, we continually always have questions on, are genomics going to replace phenotypes? And can you explain that a little bit to the group?
Sure. I get that question a lot. And the answer is no, you have to have both phenotypes and genomics. And the reason for that is we use phenotypes to give us a baseline to say how that genomic is related to, how the genomics are related to performance. And so if you just have numbers, we'll relate the genomics to that. So say you have like 1 to 5 on, you know, a couple different locations in the genome. If you don't have the performance, say weaning weights, to tie that back to, you wouldn't know if a 5 was good or bad unless you had the weaning weights to figure out, oh, that 5 relates to an animal that does really good at weaning. He's a 119 ratio. And this 1 relates back to an animal that's an 84 weaning ratio. And so you need the phenotypes to put together a baseline for your genomic evaluations.
Okay, there's another question there now, Kari. What are the submission dates? I'm guessing that's in order to participate in the genomic analysis.
Sure. And I assume you mean maybe like limits, or do you mean actually, do you have to have your data in by this certain date to get EPDs in the genetic analysis? So I'll answer both of those questions. The first answer is back to that slide that I showed, and Collin, I'm sure you have those on the BBU website somewhere, right? Your data limits.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, and so those can be found on the BBU website for when you need to do weaning weights or yearling weights. And then as far as submission dates to participate in the genetic analysis, we do analysis for BBU twice a year. and Collin, correct me if I'm wrong, but one is usually like early spring, January, that kind of thing. And then is one in the summer time as well?
That's correct. Usually right there the first of the year and right around the July period is when we'll start gathering that data for you guys.
Right. And so just knowing that, you know, really by having most of your data in by the end of December is good. And just trying to make sure that things are up to date probably by the end of June for the next analysis are just good things to shoot for.
Yes, and if you...
So end of December, end of June.
Yes, ma'am. And if you'll watch our e-news that come out on a every other week basis, as well as the BBU news and the Beefmaster Cowman, we'll typically publish dates on when we'll cut those submissions off so that we can make sure and have all that data entered in plenty of time to go into the evaluation with Kari and John. Do we have any other questions out there at this time? Well, we certainly appreciate your time today, Kari, and speaking to the group and sharing a bit more information on how everything kind of starts to tie together from raw data collection through the evaluation and then the use of genomics somewhat as well. So we will have this posted and it's recorded, so we'll get it out in front of everyone again. If you only caught part of it or have someone that you want to share it with, be sure and send that over. But we appreciate everyone being on today, and we certainly appreciate your time, Kari.
Thank you very much for having me. Everyone have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.